Breaking. In one single night, the most strategic bridge Russia relied on in this entire sector was blown apart in a fiery blast that lit up the sky and sent shockwaves across the river valley. You can imagine it. A massive plume of fire ripping upward, chunks of steel collapsing into the dark water below, and Russian soldiers scattering in every direction as the ground beneath them literally swallowed their only escape route. Breaking flashes across the screen as satellite images zoom in, highlighting the exact section of the bridge that was turned into twisted metal. Drone footage shows the flames still burning, smoke drifting over the river like a storm cloud swallowing the horizon. This was not an accident. This was a trap. A trap so precise, so perfectly timed, so devastating, that the entire Russian command structure in the area has been thrown into absolute panic. For weeks, Ukrainian forces had been watching, quietly, patiently, waiting for that moment when Russian troops would step onto the crossing. They mapped every movement, they tracked every patrol. They recorded exactly when the Russian columns moved, how long it took them to deploy, how many trucks, how many soldiers, how many armored vehicles were pushed across the river each night. Then, the moment the largest wave of Russian troops began their crossing, Ukraine unleashed a strike so sudden and so violent that Moscow reportedly lost all communication with the forward units for hours. The bridge that Russia claimed was reinforced, protected, and monitored was obliterated before anyone on the ground could react. As the flames rose, reports began pouring in from local channels across the region. Russian supply routes instantly went dark. Convoys froze in place, unsure whether to advance or retreat. Panic spread across the Russian lines, with intercepted communications capturing officers shouting over each other, trying to understand what happened, trying to figure out how such a massive failure had occurred on what they insisted was a secure crossing point. Russian soldiers, many of them exhausted conscripts, were seen scrambling along the riverbank, trapped on the wrong side, completely cut off from reinforcements, supplies, or any hope of retreat. Meanwhile, on the Ukrainian side, the mood shifted from tense anticipation to explosive celebration as confirmation came in that the operation had worked exactly as planned. Millions of Russians back home woke up to headlines they were not prepared for. Analysts in Moscow called the event a logistical nightmare. Families of soldiers posted frantic messages online, asking whether their sons had been on the bridge at the time of the blast. Social media channels in Belgorod, Voronezh, Kursk, and other nearby regions erupted with questions, fears, rumors. Some claimed that entire Russian battalions had been left stranded. Others said that armored vehicles were now stuck on the riverbank with no fuel and no command guidance. No one knew the exact number of casualties, but everyone understood the truth. A major Russian operation had just been shattered in an instant. The location of the bridge itself adds even more weight to the disaster. Positioned at a key crossing connecting frontline units with critical supply hubs, the bridge served as a lifeline for Russian logistics. Military analysts had warned for months that if Ukraine managed to sever this artery, Russia's momentum in the region would collapse. Yet despite all the warnings, Moscow insisted the bridge was safe, insisting Ukrainian forces did not have the capability or the timing to take it out effectively. That illusion lasted right up until the moment the first explosion detonated beneath the steel supports and sent shockwaves powerful enough to be detected by seismic sensors miles away. Local officials attempted to downplay the chaos, but witnesses described scenes they could not ignore. Long lines of Russian vehicles frozen on the highways, headlights stretching far into the night. Helicopters circling overhead with searchlights sweeping across the broken riverbanks. Emergency crews rushing to the scene only to find access blocked, orders unclear, leadership silent. Residents miles away reported hearing the thunder of the explosion, then the eerie silence that followed as Russia struggled to grasp what had just happened. For the first time in this region, civilians openly questioned whether Moscow actually had control of its own frontline operations. And as daylight revealed the full scale of the destruction, the grim reality became impossible for Russia to hide. The bridge did not simply crack. It did not take damage. It was gone. The center span had collapsed completely into the water. The steel beams were bent outward, as if ripped apart by invisible hands. The remaining sections dangled dangerously, ready to fall at any moment. Engineers declared the crossing unusable for months, maybe longer. Russian reporters who attempted to film the damage were quickly pulled back by military police, their footage confiscated, their broadcasts abruptly cut. But one question immediately rose to the surface. How did Ukraine know? How did they time the strike so perfectly that it hit at the exact moment Russian forces were mid-crossing? Was it drones? Was it satellites? Was it intelligence from deep inside the Russian ranks? Or was this part of a much larger operation that Moscow never saw coming? And even more importantly, Why was Russia unable to control the situation afterward? Why did the command structures break down so quickly? Why did the soldiers appear so uncoordinated, so panicked, so lost? These are the questions we need to dig into. Because if this one bridge is enough to unravel an entire Russian operation, then what does that say about the state of Moscow's military machine right now? And could this moment mark a true turning point in the war? A moment when Ukraine proves it can outsmart and outmaneuver even Russia's most fortified positions? Stay with me until the end of this video, because the deeper we go into this incident, the more it becomes clear that this was not just a strike, this was a message. And it is a message that Moscow never wanted to hear. What happened on that riverbank was not luck. It was not coincidence. It was the result of weeks of calculated patience. The kind of patience that drives an army mad because they know something is coming. They just do not know when. Ukrainian commanders studied the terrain like surgeons examining a vital artery. They understood that the river was not just a geographic barrier, it was a choke point, a place where Russian forces had no choice but to funnel through in predictable numbers, predictable formations, predictable timing. Behind the scenes, intelligence teams watched the Russian columns move in repetitive cycles, a pattern so rigid that even amateur analysts could see the weakness forming. Ukraine did not fire early. They did not fire late. They waited until the exact moment when Russian boots, trucks and armor were halfway across, suspended between two banks with no cover, no fallback, and no possibility of escape. According to insider military sources, this operation had been rehearsed virtually dozens of times. Every part of the strike was simulated, down to the second, down to the meter. Ukrainian artillery units, drone teams, and special operators were all synced through a network that allowed them to identify not just the best moment to strike, but the moment when the maximum number of Russian forces would be immobilized. Some analysts say the intelligence came from drones flying so high they were invisible to Russian radars. Others whisper that Ukrainian forces may have received real-time satellite data from Western partners. But a growing number of military insiders believe something even more explosive. Someone inside the Russian ranks may have tipped off Ukraine about the schedule of the crossing. Whatever the source, the result was devastating. As the Russian column rolled out onto the bridge, the first warning sign came from a drone operator who spotted a cluster of vehicles moving slower than usual. That was it. The command was given. In a matter of seconds, a swarm of guided artillery shells streaked across the sky like burning spears, followed by precision drones that dove straight toward the central span of the bridge. Witnesses said the explosions were so synchronized, they sounded like one continuous roar. The force of the blast ripped open the steel supports, as if the bridge had been punched from below by a giant fist. Vehicles were tossed into the river like toys. Soldiers on the bridge had no time to react. Those on the riverbank were thrown backward as the shockwave rolled through the valley. Satellite footage released hours after the strike showed the bridge glowing red-hot, still burning from the explosions. Analysts circled the damage zones, pointing out the unmistakable signature of precision strikes. This was not random shelling, this was surgical destruction. And every detail pointed to a carefully orchestrated attack with one goal: sever Russia's supply artery at the exact moment it was most vulnerable. As the bridge collapsed, the consequences were felt instantly. Russian supply trucks that had been waiting to cross were left stranded on the road, unable to move forward or backward. Lines of vehicles stretched for miles, engines idling, headlights illuminating the darkness in a chaotic maze of confused soldiers and stalled convoys. Communications between units were disrupted. Officers were heard screaming for updates, desperately trying to reach their forward positions, only to hear static or terrified voices shouting over each other. Panic spread deep into the Russian ranks as rumors exploded. Some said the bridge was sabotaged. Others believed Ukraine was preparing a massive ground assault. A few insisted it was an inside job, and while Russian forces scrambled, Ukrainian troops were already analyzing the effectiveness of the strike. Drones circled overhead, capturing footage of abandoned vehicles and soldiers attempting to swim across the river, the current sweeping them downstream. The fear in their movements was unmistakable. They were cut off, isolated, and fully aware that Ukrainian artillery could strike them again at any moment. This was the kind of psychological blow that military strategists dream of delivering. Not just breaking an enemy position, but breaking their morale. Russian state media tried to downplay the damage, claiming the bridge had only suffered partial destruction. But within hours, local footage leaked across social networks, showing the truth. The central span was completely gone. Trucks were submerged in the river. Soldiers were huddled on the muddy banks, cold, wet, and terrified. Engineers attempted to assess the ruins, but quickly realized the crossing was unsalvageable without months of reconstruction. Even makeshift pontoon bridges would be vulnerable, because Ukrainian forces now had total fire control over the entire zone. Every attempt to rebuild would be met with instant strikes. The direct fallout was immediate and brutal. Russian units on the front lines began rationing food and ammunition. Medical supplies ran dangerously low. Some units reported they had not received fuel in 2 days. Commanders attempted to find alternate routes, but every path was longer, more dangerous, and under constant surveillance from Ukrainian drones. Civilians in surrounding villages witnessed Russian soldiers abandoning vehicles on the roadside, walking in groups toward temporary camps, their uniforms soaked, their faces pale with confusion and disbelief. These images spread quickly, feeding the narrative that Russia's once confident invasion force was now stumbling, disorganized, and desperate. Analysts in Kyiv called the operation a masterclass in timing. Western experts described it as one of the most precise ambushes of the war. But the reaction that truly shocked observers came from Moscow itself. For the first time, high-ranking Russian officials openly admitted that the strike had disrupted their operational plans. That admission alone was a sign of how serious the situation was. The Kremlin rarely acknowledges setbacks, especially not in real time. But what stunned them most was not the loss of the bridge. It was what happened immediately afterward. Because this single explosion created a chain reaction that reached far beyond the riverbank. Russian forces trapped on the western side were not just cut off. They were exposed, vulnerable, surrounded by Ukrainian units who had been waiting for this moment. And the question that began rising inside the Kremlin was terrifying. If Ukraine could take this bridge out so flawlessly, what else could they destroy? What other crossings, roads, depots, or command centers were now under threat? That is the question that leads us straight into the next part of this story. Because the shock for Moscow did not end with the blast, the real panic began with what happened next. And what happened next changed everything. What unfolded after the bridge collapsed was far more catastrophic than the initial explosion itself. Because the destruction of a single crossing is one thing, but the chain reaction it unleashed across the Russian lines turned a tactical failure into a strategic disaster. As the sun rose and exposed the wreckage, Ukrainian commanders immediately recognized the scale of the blow they had delivered. Russian units stationed west of the river were now isolated, completely cut off from their supply routes. Fuel trucks were stuck on the far side, ammunition stockpiles were unreachable, and medical teams found themselves powerless to help wounded soldiers who were trapped with no evacuation path. It was as if a massive curtain had fallen between the two sides of the Russian force, slicing their entire operation in half. This alone caused panic. But what came next shattered the facade of Russian control in the region. Reports began emerging of entire battalions unable to communicate with one another. Officers supposedly sent to stabilize the situation were either missing, unreachable, or overwhelmed. Some Russian soldiers attempted to construct makeshift rafts to cross the river, only to be swept downstream or struck by Ukrainian fire the moment they pushed off the bank. Others huddled together in abandoned farmhouses, terrified that Ukrainian drones circling overhead would identify their heat signatures. A few desperate groups even attempted to dig trenches along the river's edge, but the soil was soaked and unstable, causing the walls to collapse in on them as they worked. Meanwhile, Ukraine seized the initiative. Drone operators targeted Russian logistics routes, striking fuel convoys before they could even turn around. Artillery crews hammered the temporary staging zones Russia had established in a frantic attempt to reorganize. Engineers who were sent to survey the destroyed bridge found themselves under constant bombardment, forced to abandon their equipment and flee. Every hour that passed made the situation worse for Russia. Supplies dwindled. Morale collapsed. The operational map that Russian generals relied on suddenly meant nothing, because the territory had turned into a maze of stranded units, broken lines, and exposed positions. This is where the effects rippled outward and attracted the attention of the world. International observers from NATO immediately flagged the incident as one of the most significant developments of the entire war. Analysts in Washington described it as a critical pivot point. European media outlets ran headlines declaring that Russia's offensive had been cut in half overnight. Officials in Poland and the Baltic states quietly celebrated, noting that the collapse of Russia's logistics network exposed severe weaknesses that NATO had long suspected but had never seen so clearly. Even intelligence agencies in Germany and France publicly acknowledged that this was a moment Moscow would not easily recover from. The United States issued a statement emphasizing the importance of secure supply lines and hinting that Ukraine's capabilities were improving faster than anyone had anticipated. Some American analysts suggested that the precision of the strike indicated Ukraine now possessed a level of real-time coordination that rivaled even major Western militaries. British military experts went further, arguing that the collapse of the bridge represented a humiliating turning point for Russia, and that continued Ukrainian success could force Moscow into either drastic escalation or painful retreat. Inside Russia, the reaction was chaotic. State media scrambled to produce explanations, offering conflicting narratives that confused even their own viewers. Some channels claimed the bridge collapsed due to poor construction. Others insisted it was hit by an overwhelming barrage of NATO weaponry. A few fringe commentators declared that it was an act of sabotage by Russian soldiers themselves. But none of these stories held up once local footage leaked. The images told the truth that Moscow could not spin. Russia had been outmaneuvered, outplanned, out-executed. As the panic spread across Russian social media platforms, families of frontline soldiers begged for updates. Videos of stranded Russian troops circulated widely, showing young conscripts shivering near the riverbank, their uniforms torn, their vehicles abandoned. Comments poured in from across Russia, demanding answers, accountability, and leadership. Instead, what they received were vague reassurances and empty promises about restoring stability. Those promises meant nothing to the soldiers trapped in the mud with no food, no ammunition, and no command structure left to follow. This brings us to the long-term consequences. Because this strike did not only disrupt a single operation, it undermined Russia's entire strategic posture in the region. With the bridge gone and no viable replacement available, Russia's ability to reinforce or resupply its western units collapsed. Every alternative route was longer, more exposed, and fully within Ukraine's line of fire. The psychological effect was even more devastating. Soldiers who once believed in Moscow's narrative of strength and superiority now saw the undeniable truth that the Ukrainian military was capable of outsmarting them at every turn. Strategic planners in Kyiv understood the significance. With Russia's logistics crippled, Ukraine could now apply pressure at multiple points, forcing Moscow to stretch its weakened forces even thinner. This shift in momentum could reshape the battlefield for months, maybe even years. If Russia could not repair its supply chain quickly, its entire front line in the region might begin to crumble. And that is why some analysts are calling this the beginning of a much larger collapse. Because once the backbone of a military operation weakens, everything built on top of it begins to fall apart. Command structures falter. Morale plummets. Offensive capabilities shrink. Defensive positions become liabilities. This bridge strike could be the moment historians look back on and say, this was it. This was the point where Russia's campaign began to unravel. Which leads us to the question that hangs over the Kremlin now like a storm cloud. What does Moscow have left? What options remain when the enemy can strike at your most vital infrastructure with perfect timing? How do you maintain control when your soldiers no longer trust the roads, the bridges, or the commanders leading them across those bridges? Russia is now facing a crisis unlike anything it has dealt with since the start of the war. A crisis of logistics, a crisis of confidence, a crisis of strategy, and most importantly, a crisis of credibility. Because if Moscow cannot protect its own troops during a simple river crossing, how can it claim to control the broader battlefield? That is the question we will carry into the next part of this series. As we move into the final chapter, we will explore the full impact of this blow, the international reactions still unfolding, and the future consequences Russia cannot avoid. And by the end, you will understand why this moment could be the turning point that determines the outcome of the entire war. As the shockwaves from the bridge collapse continued, spreading far beyond the river valley, a new layer of consequences began revealing itself, one that reached deep into Moscow's political core. In the days following the strike, Russian strategic planners scrambled to rewrite their entire operational map, but it quickly became clear that no amount of redrawing lines or shifting arrows could fix the fundamental weakness that had now been exposed. Without a stable supply route, entire Russian formations were left hanging in limbo. What was once a coordinated push across multiple fronts suddenly looked like a fractured maze of stalled units, abandoned equipment, and commanders who no longer trusted the territory they were standing on. Inside the Kremlin, frustration boiled over. Rumors began circulating that high-ranking officials were pointing fingers at one another behind closed doors, demanding explanations for how such a critical crossing was left exposed. Military leaders insisted they had requested additional defenses for weeks, only to be ignored. Political figures blamed intelligence failures. Intelligence agencies accused field commanders of incompetence. And through all of this chaos, one truth became impossible for them to ignore. Ukraine had struck at the perfect moment, and Russia had absolutely no answer. Meanwhile, Ukraine took full advantage of the confusion. With Russian units locked in place and supply lines twisted into knots, Ukrainian forces increased pressure across multiple sectors. Drone swarms probed every weak point in the Russian line. Artillery units targeted retreating convoys heading away from the riverfront. Special forces teams moved in, capturing abandoned Russian outposts and gathering intelligence from command posts left behind in the frenzy. Every inch of ground that Russia had held for months was suddenly vulnerable, and Ukraine pushed forward with renewed confidence. Internationally, the reaction was electric. The United States released a statement praising the precision and effectiveness of Ukraine's battlefield strategy, emphasizing that the operation demonstrated the growing sophistication of Ukrainian military planning. NATO representatives echoed those sentiments, noting openly that Russia's inability to secure a single critical river crossing called into question its entire logistical framework. Even traditionally cautious European governments stepped forward to acknowledge that the war had entered a new phase, one in which Ukraine was no longer merely defending but actively setting the tempo. Poland, Lithuania, and the Baltic states responded with even stronger rhetoric, stating that Russia's failure to maintain basic supply infrastructure revealed deep rot within the Russian military system. In Warsaw, analysts described the bridge collapse as a window into the future, suggesting that similar Russian weaknesses could be exploited across other contested regions. German media outlets went further, calling the event a clear sign that Russia's war machine was cracking under pressure. The narrative was shifting. The world no longer saw Russia as an unstoppable aggressor. Instead, it was beginning to look like a cornered force fighting to maintain an illusion of strength. Back on the ground, Russian soldiers trapped west of the river faced a reality far harsher than anything state television dared to report. Food rations were stretched thin. Ammunition stocks dwindled to critical levels. Medical evacuation routes were non-existent. Some units reported going days without direct communication from their superiors. Abandoned armored vehicles became temporary shelters. Makeshift fires were lit in pits to avoid drone detection. Morale plummeted with each passing hour, and whispers of surrender began surfacing among exhausted conscripts whose uniforms were soaked with river mud and whose boots were falling apart. This was the moment when Russian families, glued to their phones thousands of miles away, began posting desperate questions online. Why had the bridge not been rebuilt? Why were their sons unable to return? Why had there been no official update from the Ministry of Defense? Instead of answers, they received silence. A silence so heavy, so unsettling, that it ignited suspicion across Russia's already tense society. Analysts in Moscow warned that the bridge disaster could inflame public dissatisfaction at a time when the Kremlin was already navigating economic strain, domestic unrest, and international isolation. The long-term implications grew clearer with each new analysis. Without a reliable route across the river, Russia would need to reroute thousands of tons of supplies along roads that were not only longer but exposed to Ukrainian fire. Every alternative crossing was now under constant surveillance. Every movement risked another precision strike. This transformed a single tactical setback into a strategic chokehold. Ukraine had not just destroyed a bridge, they had severed the artery that kept an entire segment of the Russian frontline alive. And as pressure mounted, Russian commanders faced a painful truth. To restore the crossing, they would need to bring in engineering battalions, heavy machinery, and large transport convoys, but doing so would be like placing targets inside a shooting gallery. Ukraine had demonstrated control over the skies, control over the riverbanks, and control over the timing of every move. Rebuilding the bridge was no longer a technical challenge. It was a death sentence for any unit ordered to attempt it. That is why many observers believe this moment marks a turning point. Not just in this battle, not just in this region, but in the trajectory of the entire war. Because the destruction of the bridge did more than eliminate a supply line. It shattered Russia's image of invulnerability. It exposed the cracks in its planning, the fragility of its logistics, and the chaos within its command structure. When an army can no longer trust its own infrastructure, it loses the ability to advance, to coordinate, and eventually, to fight. Some experts have gone as far as to say this could be the beginning of the end for Russia's offensive capabilities. If one precision strike can break an entire operation, then what happens when Ukraine targets the next bridge, the next supply depot, the next rail hub? What happens when Russian soldiers, already exhausted and demoralized, begin to question every order because they fear every road, every crossing, every command post might be next? This is why the Kremlin now finds itself in a crisis unlike any it has faced in decades. A crisis of logistics, of morale, of leadership, and of legitimacy. A crisis that is eroding the foundation of its war effort from the inside out. And as Ukraine continues to gain confidence, supported by a global community watching closely, one question echoes louder than all the rest. What card does the Kremlin have left to play? What move could possibly reverse the momentum that is now building against them? Let me ask you directly. Do you believe Russia can regain control after a blow like this? Do you think this bridge collapse marks the beginning of a larger unraveling? Share your thoughts in the comments, because your perspective matters. And if you want to stay ahead of every major twist and every critical development in this war, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. This story is far from over, and the next chapter might just be the most explosive one yet. If you felt the weight of what just happened, if you believe this bridge strike could truly shift the course of the war, then make sure you hit the like button right now. It tells the algorithm that this story matters. And if you want to stay ahead of every critical update, every breaking moment, every twist that Russia does not want the world to see, then subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how big this turning point really is. Your engagement pushes this information further and helps build a community of people who refuse to look away from the truth. So like, comment your thoughts below, subscribe, and stay with me, because what comes next could change everything.